Hello and welcome to another episode of Masala History. My name is Siva and I try to bring you lesser known interesting stories from across the world, back them up with historical research and present them for easy consumption. This is my attempt to make history cool. First off, a big thank you to all of you who listened to my podcast, my first one. And actually, half of you managed to stay awake till the end of the podcast. That's pretty impressive. For those of you who felt it was a nice lullaby or boring, please do give it another chance and send in your feedback. I was quite amazed at the variety of feedback that I got and also the range of people who listen to the stories, right from 13-year-olds to 70-year-olds. So I'm very encouraged, humbled, and I'm going to keep making further attempts. So do keep your feedback coming on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being yuck and 10 being wow. Of course, negative markings allowed. I still expect you to be kind. Enough with that chit chat, and with that, we are going to move into today's episode now. So we are continuing with the theme of alteration of history. Last week we saw how it was very simple for any of us to actually take a piece of historical fact, mix it with mythology and stories, and create a WhatsApp viral forward. But what if the facts were actually altered systematically, let's say by a power like the state itself? What happens? And that's what we are going to actually see. Of course, in the modern world, you've got like tons of tools at your fingertips on your cell phone to be able to change photographs, change documents, make them look absolutely real, and whatnot. But 100 years back, when none of this existed, what did the powers try to do, and how did they attempt to change history? And that's what we're going to see today. To understand this story, we are going to go into Eastern Europe behind the Iron Curtain, the Soviet Union. We are traveling in time back to 15th March 1917. Uh, on this day, Russia was actually in the middle of the First World War, fighting on the side of France and Britain against Germany. However, it was also having a lot of internal tussle, and Nicholas Romanov II decided to abdicate his throne. He ended the 400-year-old rule of the Romanov dynasty in Russia. When this happened, this man, Vladimir Ulyanov, who is popularly known as Lenin, saw this as a completely historic moment, and rightfully so. He was in Switzerland in exile at that time. He decided to make a famous journey all the way from Switzerland to St. Petersburg. He used trains, boats, sledges. He was assisted by German intelligence at that point in time, though a lot of people did not know this. And perhaps someday I will actually do a separate podcast on this fantastic journey that he undertook. But net on April 16th, 1917, finally, Mr. Lenin landed in the Finland station of St. Petersburg. Those of you who've had any interest in Russian history possibly remember this photograph. This was the start of the revolution in Russia. First, the April Revolution, followed by the October Revolution of 1917. Finally, where Bolsheviks took power and Lenin became the supreme authority of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Cut to 1924, Lenin died of heart attack, and he was followed by this person here, Joseph Jugashvili, who is also known as Koba, who was also known as the boss, and who is popularly known as Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin is one of the top three dictators and mass murderers of all times, and is also the hero of today's story. I would like to call him the original father of photoshopping, and you will see why. Joseph Stalin never trusted anybody. In 1936, he started what is today called as the Great Purge. He managed to kill more than 750,000 people. Most of them were his friends, his confidants, his Politburo members, basically people that he decided not to trust at a certain point in time and started getting rid of them. Now, the problem was that there were several people who were up against him, and Stalin wanted to prove that he was Lenin's true successor. During this time in 1937, the 20-year commemoration of Lenin's arrival in St. Petersburg was going to be celebrated, and Stalin decided to use that moment. Now, if you actually observe this photograph very clearly, you will start understanding that this is not even a photograph. It's actually a canvas, a painting that Stalin commissioned. The original photograph is not traced; it's not available anymore. And in this painting, you can see that Stalin has comfortably positioned himself behind Lenin, who's waving the hat. Now, this is quite interesting because Stalin never made this train journey with Lenin, nor was he in the Finland station in St. Petersburg to receive Lenin in the first place. But yet, here he is, standing behind Lenin in this quote unquote picture, showing to the rest of the Soviet Union that he was Lenin's true successor. This was one of his first attempts at retouching photographs, and encouraged by the success of this, where he managed to fool several million people, Stalin continued this brilliant industry forward. During this time, Lenin's closest confidant Trotsky was already exiled out of Soviet Union, and Stalin was making enough attempts to assassinate him. However, even before he could actually assassinate Trotsky, Stalin started assassinating him in photographs. This picture, taken in 1919, is one of Lenin's famous addresses where he's standing in a carriage. And you can see on the circle on the picture on your left, Trotsky is standing right below Lenin. But on the doctored picture, which is on the right hand side of your screen, you would see that Trotsky is vanished. Another picture where Lenin is standing in center of this crowd, again from 1919, and Trotsky is seen to Lenin's left, making a salute. And kaboom, 20 years later, Mr. Trotsky vanishes into thin air in this picture as well. Of course, Trotsky was finally assassinated in 1940 in Mexico City. Let's continue our journey into this whole photo doctoring situation. On this picture right now, you see in the center is seated Molotov, who was a Soviet premier under Stalin. Those of you who may have heard Molotov cocktail, by the way, Molotov cocktail is not a real cocktail, it's actually cheap bombs. Anyway, so Molotov is surrounded by five of his closest deputies, and onto Molotov's left, sitting, is Abel Inkuzidze. He ran out of favor with Stalin. He was shot dead in 1937, and kaboom, in 1938, the photograph went without him, and you can see Kodziev, who is actually standing behind Molotov. His suit was drawn in full as a proper retouch. Such was Stalin's fantastic photo doctoring setup. In fact, for those of you who are fans of Steven Spielberg's Back to the Future, sometimes I actually feel that they borrowed all these ideas from Joseph Stalin. If you remember in that particular movie, Marty goes around into sort of time travel back into history with this photograph. He alters events in history, and as a result of which, he starts losing people in the photograph, essentially. Now, I think this was completely lifted off Stalin's life, and you'll see why. Onto the top left, you could see Stalin happily posing with three of his closest deputies in the year 1926. One by one, the deputies fell out of favor, and this photo was retouched as each of them fell out of favor and perhaps fell out of the face of the earth as well. And eventually, you can see that by the time we hit 1939, it's only Stalin in the picture, and the rest of them are completely gone. Kaboom. The other thing is that usually, karma catches up with you. Here is an example of that. On the left, you see Nikolai Ezov, who was one of the sort of prominent guys who oversaw Stalin's purges. He fell out of favor with Stalin in the year 1938, and he was killed himself. And of course, as ironical as it sounds, this photo was retouched, removing Azov from the picture and completing the canal and the bridge where they are actually standing. Stalin did not run this entire photo doctoring operation as a covert, controlled stuff. In fact, it was run very ad hoc. Whenever somebody was desired to be assassinated or gotten rid of, Stalin's henchmen and his deputies would call publishers, would tell them the name of the victim. The publishers would not ask a single question, regardless of how popular the victim was, and they would start retouching photographs. Sometimes they would go back to 20 years, 30 years, and cutting out people away from photographs and replacing them either with natural scenery or perhaps with handsome photographs of Stalin himself to please the dictator. Of course, the trick part was that if you were one of the common civilians who had originals of those photographs, you were better off either erasing these people with ink or cutting them out, or better, destroying the complete evidence. Because if you were found in possession of these photographs with people that Stalin didn't like, well, perhaps you know how it would end. Sometimes some of these retouchings were actually done not even on the orders of Stalin. So this photograph that you see on your screen right now is an example. This is an iconic picture that is from the Battle of Berlin, where German soldiers are hoisting the communist Soviet Union flag above the Reichstag, the German parliament. Now this photograph was completely staged and taken and touched to make sure that Stalin is happy. In the real picture, you could not see this dramatic scene, and on top of it, the soldiers on the picture were actually wearing German watches and things like that because they looted this from German civilians, and Stalin did not like looting. So they had to please the boss, and so they started retouching pictures to keep the boss happy. If you ask me, the one good thing about this whole photo doctoring industry that Stalin ran was the fact that it was not run as a covert and controlled operation, because of which many of the originals existed, and because of that, today we know that these photographs were indeed doctored and retouched and stuff like that. Otherwise, there was no way for us to actually find out who existed and what was the true history. It is to be said that though Stalin was not the first person to start changing history, it's always been done by those in power. And even in terms of photo doctoring, Stalin was not the only one, though he may have been the one to use it for mass propaganda. All the big dictators have always tried it. You can see Hitler doing this. In fact, he got rid of Goebbels, his closest confidant, for reasons unknown. We've heard Mussolini doctoring photographs, and even today there are stories of Kim Jong Un who uses Photoshop to show that his ears are smaller than what they actually are. The chances of factual truth surviving onslaught of power are very, very slim. And in today's WhatsApp world, anybody can take a picture or a video and alter it to make it believable, whether it is the Chinese celebrating Olympics with fireworks, whether it is Obama dancing for Kolaveri, or even me getting quarantined with Deepika Padukone. So my humble request is seek the truth, for usually what you see may not what it actually is supposed to be. That brings us to the end of today's episode. Thanks for listening. Please don't forget to subscribe Masala History by Siva at Facebook and Instagram, and keep the feedback coming. Stay safe and talk to you soon.